Well, good morning, everyone. Wonderful to see such a great turnout here this morning. My name is Richard Downie. I'm Deputy Director of the Africa Programme here at CSIS. Welcome to the latest event in our Statesmen's Forum series, in which we invite prominent world leaders to present their views about critical policy issues before a public audience in Washington and on the web as well today. It's a great pleasure this morning to welcome back to CSIS the Prime Minister of Kenya, Raila Odinga. I think the last time you were with us, Prime Minister, was back in early summer of 2008, only a few months after the presidential election crisis had died down. Here in the United States, I think many of us who'd got accustomed to thinking of Kenya as a stable and peaceful country were jolted somewhat out of our complacency by those events. Since then, we've been following events very closely, and we're glad that Kenya, such a close friend of the United States, has started to pick itself up from that traumatic experience. But it's been a tough road. There's been a lot of soul-searching, and compromises and tough decisions have had to be made. And Prime Minister, you've had to make more than most, adjusting to the stresses and strains of a power-sharing government while trying to put Kenya back on the right footing by addressing some of those structural problems and grievances which led to the explosion of violence in those closing days of 2008 and opening weeks of 2008. One of the key challenges still to be overcome is how to break out of this destructive cycle, which we see in so many countries in Africa, where politicians have sought to win electoral support by making ethnic appeals, emphasizing divisions rather than trying to bridge them. Now in Kenya, a very important breakthrough last summer was passing a constitution which would provide a framework for getting beyond some of these divisions. It's the standout achievement, I think, so far of the Grand Coalition government, strongly endorsed by the Kenyan people in a referendum. The challenge, of course, is the implementation. The jury is still out on whether who will prevail, the reformers or those who wish to defend the status quo. But I'm very pleased to count the Prime Minister as a member of the reformist camp. I'm looking forward to him speaking this morning about those outstanding challenges, perhaps in the questions afterwards about the Constitution. Other big challenges since the last election, of course, have been addressing the root causes of the violence and bringing to justice the main orchestrators of that violence. The International Criminal Court has become the venue for that investigation, and the 6 suspects, including cabinet ministers, have within the past week appeared at The Hague to answer summonses in relation to that inquiry. Now, of course, the need to address these issues and the wider causes of violence become all the more urgent as Kenya once more prepares to enter another election cycle in 2012. So next summer's elections will be a major test of how far Kenya has come since 2007. Now, at the heart of all these challenges I've outlined is the need for good governance. And so it's very fortunate this morning that the Prime Minister has indeed chosen this theme, good governance and democracy, as the subject of his address. We're looking forward to hearing his remarks touching on Kenya, but also the broader challenges, I think, of good governance in Africa, in which he's been personally invested recently in his unique experience he's been able to offer of power-sharing government at home, lending his support to mediation efforts by the AU, the African Union, in the likes of Ivory Coast, also closely following events in another power-sharing government that's unraveling in Zimbabwe. So we're going to be very interested to hear his views on these crises and the other challenges of governance in the African continent, particularly this worrying tendency of contested election outcomes, which is popping up in so many countries. So much to talk about. We're very grateful for such a timely visit. With that, I'll hand over to the Prime Minister, and afterwards we'll hopefully have plenty of time for members of the audience to ask questions as well. So, Mr. Odinga, welcome.
Thank you very much for such a very elaborate introduction. but I say good morning. In Swahili, we say hamjambo. First, allow me to express my appreciation for the opportunity you've given me to address you this morning. The Center for Strategic and International Studies is one of the world's leading think tanks, and I believe its reputation is thoroughly deserved. I have had occasion to talk to you on varying subjects, and each time I come here, I come wiser than I came into the audience here. Your crucial work looking for solutions to foreign policy, security, and development problems continues to have a tremendous impact on the international community. I want to speak to you this morning on a subject that is causing growing anxiety among many of us in Africa and most of you here with us this morning. That subject is what appears to be the democracy deadlock in Africa. Is democracy under siege in Africa? Are we progressing or are we regressing? That is actually the subject I want to talk about. There's real fear in Africa that a new pattern of failing elections is emerging. It is all the more alarming that this represents a sharp regression. After the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, we saw in Africa the emergence of what we called the second liberation. This established or re-established multi-party political systems and demanded greater transparency and accountability in the management of national affairs. It swept out some of those old dictators and began a new era that promised an end to election rigging. And in some ways, it has worked. Most African countries have established multi-party democratic systems. There has been competitions, and there has been appreciable progress that has been made. This is actually evidenced by the increased growth that we have registered on the continent. In average, most African countries or economies have registered above 5% growth over the last 10 years. And today, elections are vigorously contested across the continent. Since 2007, at least 10 African countries have held presidential or parliamentary votes or constitutional referenda. This year, 21 nations will go to the polls. Opposition parties are better organized, election monitoring is more effective, and voters are better informed. People are no longer silent in the face of election fraud, and African leaders can no longer guarantee themselves landslide victories like in the past. They know they will face challenges at the polls and that they could lose to their opponents. For the first time in its history, Africa also has retired presidents. Since 2000, more than 10 presidents have retired when their allotted terms have finished. Previously, power changed hands only by violent overthrow or assassination, or when old men died. But unhappily, some problems have arisen, and there are fears that much of Africa could be drifting towards a new authoritarianism. A significant worrying pattern is emerging of a troubled ballot. Closely fought elections with heavily disputed results are becoming the norm. Incumbents are coercing electoral commissions to skew the polls in their favor, and then, when their opponents protest, they resort to force. Many thousands die and are displaced until the international community steps in to work out some kind of power sharing arrangement. And this is what you've seen happen recently in Cote d'Ivoire. I am sure you are all aware of the Kenyan situation, where the presidential election results were disputed and the problem was resolved by an internationally mediated power sharing arrangement. This was not exactly an export to be proud of, but now, alarmingly, it seems to have become a new tool for dictators. It is a template that was enthusiastically embraced by Mr. Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe, who used it to resolve his own rigged elections. Unequal power is characteristic of a coalition government, with incumbents grabbing the lion's share. In Zimbabwe, Mugabe's side retained control of the military, police, and security services, what you can call the instruments of power, leaving their coalition partners with economic development and reconstruction. Mugabe's coalition partners was thus expected to rebuild the nation after conflict, while being undermined by Mr. Mugabe's side. The result has been deadlock in government and paralysis in the country. Kenya's case is not dissimilar. Most damaging of all, the coalition arrangement in Kenya and its inherent tensions have meant that preparing for the next election has been almost continuous since the conclusion of the last one. This has distracted from critical day-to-day issues and has often rendered Parliament a theater of the absurd. The lesson being learned here is that power sharing is at best a deeply unstable temporary measure with negative long-term consequences. The continent has seen other depressing developments. In Gabon and Togo, the deaths of long-serving dictators, Omar Bongo and Nasimbe Eyadema, created room for elections in which power was smoothly transferred to their sons. Mauritania, Guinea, Madagascar, and Niger have all had coups since 2008, in most cases because of the incumbent's refusal to transfer power. In some other countries, elections are being won by incumbents after intimidation of opposition supporters. A number of other countries have held massively flawed elections that left hundreds of protesting opposition supporters dead. Opposition parties have subsequently been vandalized and many oppositionists jailed, making them unable to compete in the subsequent elections. It is telling that for the past 2 years, the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, which offers the world's richest prize to African leaders who help develop their countries and then peacefully leave office, has decided to make no awards. No leaders met the standards. There have been a few bright spots, however, such as Ghana, where presidents have twice conceded defeat and handed over power to leaders from the opposition, and Botswana and Benin are two others. South Africa has consistently exercised democratic, free and fair elections with a free media, despite the African National Congress dominance of the post-apartheid politics. But those countries that have done well are overshadowed by and outnumbered by the great majority where backsliding has occurred. Last year, Freedom House, which is based in this city, found that political freedoms are declined in 10 countries on the continent in 2009 and improved in just 4. This growing trend away from democracy includes not only pariah states such as Eritrea and Sudan, but also such key Western allies and recipients of foreign aid as my own country, as well as Ethiopia and Uganda, where troops have functioned as the de facto Western proxies in battling radical Somali Islamists in Mogadishu. The West's reluctance to challenge autocratic regimes appears driven by security concerns, leading to the fear that global politics might once again be pushing the world to tolerate dictatorship in Africa, just as it did in the Cold War. And we all know what happened during the Cold War. In those days, the enemy was communism. So long as you said that you are an ally of the West in the war against communism, nobody cared how you ran your country. You were tolerated. That is how we created Mobutu Sese Seko, Kungwaza Banga of this world. That is how we created Kamuzu Bandas, Jean Badel Bokassa, Idi Amin Dada, and so on. Everyone had a vested interest, and everyone turned a blind eye. All this is happening when groups such as the US Agency for International Development and the UK's Department for International Development are striving for the UN aid goal of 0.7% of the gross national income to ensure Millennium Development Goals are met. But if governance is bad, no amount of aid money will lift African countries out of poverty. We have to fix the politics first. So, ladies and gentlemen, I have always been an Afro-optimist, and developments in Africa give me more reason to be hopeful about the future of the continent. Some of our governments and civil societies have woken up to the fact that regular multi-party elections alone do not lead to good governance, the rule of law, and economic development, and that elections have not eradicated corruption, repression, and underdevelopment. People are demanding more than just trappings. They want constitutional changes that create inclusivity, stability, responsibility, proper separation of powers, effective checks and balances, and independent judiciary and media, and clear election schedules, and full limits on presidential terms and powers. Some nations are also working to end inter-ethnic tension through the devolution of power and genuine federalism, and to combat corruption by limiting the power of the executive and increasing government transparency. I can proudly say that Kenya leads the pack in taking proactive steps. Last year, we promulgated a new constitution that limits executive power, sets dates for elections, devolves control of resources, and sets stringent integrity and accountability requirements for leaders. I believe the idea will spread. Events in Libya, Egypt, Cote d'Ivoire, and Tunisia have shown that the people are ready to take on those who abuse power and deny the majority their due. It is also a mark of progress that the African Union summoned up the courage to take a stand in the Ivory Coast and tell the now deposed Laurent Gbagbo that he had been defeated and must leave office. As the middle class emerges and forms critical mass, as modern economy develops and professionals establish their associations and codes, and as educated youth becomes a large majority of the population, surely the yearning for true democracy will rise. It will rise to the extent that the old order can no longer contain. The peaceful birth of a new African nation, the Southern Sudan, is a case in point. This is a cause for celebration. Celebration of the democratic rights of the poorest of the poor. The culture of democratic constitutionalism has definitely taken root in parts of Africa, often thanks to citizens and civil society activists determined to make everyone count, every vote count. Progressive leaders are emerging. I believe that if this determination on the part of the people is buttressed by the support of the international community, hope is alive that these early years of the 21st century can finally see the true blossoming of the African continent. But to stay its course in charting this surer destiny, Africa needs your support. I remain optimistic that the African democratization process that has been ongoing since independence emerged on the continent is coming of age. That this 21st century is truly going to be the African century. This is the century in which we are going to see the mobilization of the massive resources that Africa has, natural and human, for faster socio-economic development of the continent. The African continent is on the upward trend. Most of the economies are now registering between 5 to 10 to 12% growth. It can only go upwards. I am confident that Africa will truly emerge. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister, for such a broad and wide-ranging address. We have a good portion of time for questions, and I thought maybe I'll use my prerogative as the chair and kick things off and talk about a country we've spent a lot of time worrying about and following here in recent weeks and months, and one that you've been involved with directly, and that's Côte d'Ivoire. Perhaps you could talk a little bit more about your role in trying to end that post-election and dispute. It seems that Gbagbo was given so many, plenty of opportunities for a soft landing, an honourable exit, rejected them all, eventually was ousted by force. How important do you think it is for the credibility of democracy in Africa that this crisis has, we hope, been resolved? Feel free to sit down or speak at the podium, whichever you prefer. Okay.
Well, it is very unfortunate that Gbagbo had to go the way he did. And I advised him that he needed to take the offer that was being given to him. I want it to be known that among the two, I know Mr. Gbagbo more longer. He's been a colleague for a very long time. When he was the real leader of the democratization struggles in the Côte d'Ivoire, when he was also in exile. And we actually started the Socialist International African Chapter together. I also know Mr. Vitara very well as an international civil servant. When he was here with the IMF, he's also come to Kenya. So we've had a long relationship with both of them. So I tried to use my closeness to try to bring understanding. And I told Mr. Gbagbo clearly that all the evidence available showed that he had lost elections. And that all the observer teams that had observed elections had said that he had lost. Of course, he insisted, it's a language that we're used to, that he won and that the Electoral Commission, which consisted of most of his opponents, had rigged the elections. that he wanted the result to be verified, that he wanted the AU to send a team of impartial people to go and verify the results. I told him that, I also won an election. But I'm not the president. so that is not the most important thing. I think the most important thing is coup d'Ivoire. And I told him that, I was asked to go to the court and challenge the results which had been announced by the Electoral Commission. I refused to go to court. Why? Because I had no confidence in the courts. The courts were not independent. The courts were appointed by the same executive that I was challenging. And the Electoral Commission also had been set up, appointed single-handedly by the executive. So it was not neutral or independent. Then they said we should have the results verified. I said no. Asked why? I said because those ballot papers had been in the custody of the same Electoral Commission which had done the rigging. And the chances that they had been tampered with were very high. So in your case, it is the reverse. These ballot papers you are talking about have been in custody of the court, the Constitutional Court, all this time. The chances that they had been tampered with are very high. So even if they are verified and it found that you won, nobody will believe you. It is an exercise in futility. So you must therefore go for a political settlement. And the political settlement is that the world perceives that you have lost. And politics is about perception. You may not have lost, but that is what the world believes. And the conditions in the coup d'Ivoire does not allow for a repeat of another election in the next foreseeable future. So you better agree and negotiate a political deal. He agreed he was going to, but then he changed his mind. I gave him an offer which I had been given to take up lectureships elsewhere, even in this country, and that they would not be persecuted, and that Vitara would agree to incorporate part of his people in a government of national unity. All that he would say yes, but then tomorrow he would say no. One, there were the generals who would not hear of that. And then, of course, there's always a woman somewhere in the equation. Not that that is not demeaning to women at all. I am very gender sensitive. But I told him that to avoid bloodshed, unnecessary bloodshed where innocent civilians would die, it was better for him to take a deal. He refused to take a deal, and therefore we ended up the way we ended up, him being now taken in almost as a captive. I have since had the occasion to send a message to Mr. Vitara that he should guarantee Mr. Gbagbo's safety for the sake of Côte d'Ivoire, that he should not be harmed, and that if he wants to go into exile, he should be allowed to go into exile somewhere. If he wants to remain in the country, he can remain, so long as he does not interfere with the political process. But that says they should also form a government that will include some of the people of Mr. Gbagbo's party in order to unite the country. Because the country is fairly polarized. There's the north-south divide. There's the religious divide. Then there is indigenous versus immigrants, what they call the ivority. So in order to heal those wounds and reconcile the society so that it's united, there's need to play a game of inclusivity rather than a game of exclusivity. a winner takes all, in my view, will not solve the long-term problem of Cote d'Ivoire. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'll open the floor to questions now. We have microphones coming around, so wait for a microphone. Please identify yourself, and let's have concise questions rather than statements. Gentleman at the front here.
Thank you. Michael Marshall from United Press International. Mr. Prime Minister, Kenya, like many countries in Africa and the developing world, has a very young population. It's skewed young. And we know that around the world, the combination of young men and no jobs is politically volatile. I wonder how you see enough jobs being provided for the young people of Kenya, particularly those who are getting an education and often don't find employment opportunities. In what fields do you see suitable employment for your huge youth population developing? Thank you.
Let's take a couple of questions, a couple of more questions. Joel up the front here. Microphone is coming. There you go.
Joel Barkin, CSIS. Two quick questions. The first, picking up on Richard's introduction about the struggle between reformers and those who want to maintain the status quo, which you alluded to yourself. Could you comment on the implications of the proceedings in The Hague, the fate of the Ocampo Six, particularly Mr. Ruto, Mr. Kenyatta, and Mr. Mathara, the events on Monday, the rally? Is reform grinding to a halt in Kenya? And secondly, in respect to your comment about U.S. tolerance for dictatorship, is that in fact occurring again in respect to U.S. Africa policy with respect to Uganda and Ethiopia? Thank you.
Let's take one more, and lady at the front here in the middle.
Honorable Prime Minister, His Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Rosemary Segero. I'm based here in Washington, D.C. I'm from Kenya. Mr. Prime Minister, Honorable, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation on not only Kenya, but Africa. Thank you for your support, and we support you. We are here, we are behind Kenya, and we are behind Africa also. My question is, how does the African Union look into all this violence in Africa when it comes to election? Are they going to come up with a policy, or what are they going to do? And we need them to involve us into these issues, because we are here as Kenyans, as Americans, and as the world watching them. So we want them to involve us into these issues. How are they looking into the elections when it comes to governance, corruption, and other issues? Thank you.
Well, yes, Kenya, the first question. Like many other African countries, has a relatively young population. In fact, according to the latest census that was carried out in 2009, about 35% and below constitute about 72% of our population. So the population, they say, can either be an asset or a curse, depending on how you look at it and how you make use of it. If the population is not empowered, then it becomes just a drag on the economy. And the solution is first and foremost to provide education, a quality education to this population, because now we are talking about a globalized world, and we in Kenya have resolved that we want to develop a knowledge-based economy. And that's why we are investing very heavily in education. We introduced free primary education, Now we have also introduced free secondary education. And we are also expanding our high institutions of learning. We want to ensure, we are also increasing the transition from primary to secondary and from secondary to university and other colleges of higher learning. Now, employment. Because employment we created depending on how the economy grows. If the economy must grow at a pace commensurate with the increase in population, so that there are employment opportunities for our people. What we have done now is we have short-term measures, mid-term and long-term. Of course, long-term is that one, we want the private sector to expand at a much faster rate to create more sustainable employment for the people. We are also investing very heavily in infrastructure. Infrastructure development provides a lot of employment for the youth of our country. Then there's this IT field, which also is creating quite a number of jobs and opportunities. Then there's the small and medium scale businesses. This is where people get self-employed. This is the factory of entrepreneurs. And the government is supporting small and medium scale enterprises in the country, because this is what will produce much more jobs for the people. Public sector employment is fairly limited. We employ as a government a total of nearly 500,000 people. And that is a very bloated bureaucracy, which we are trying to trim down by way of retrenchment. But on every year basis, we produce over 750,000 new graduates. That is, those who exit at primary level, those who exit at secondary level, those who exit at university levels. So we are very much seized with this matter, and this is how we are actually dealing with the issue of creating jobs. Joe, ICC, as you know, did not invite itself to Kenya. Kenya actually invited the ICC because the report of the Justice Waki Commission, which investigated the post-election violence, had recommended that a local tribunal be set up to deal with the perpetrators of post-election violence. But then they recommended that in the event that the government or parliament was unable to set up the tribunal, then the list which they had compiled and sealed in an envelope should be forwarded to ICC. That envelope was given to Dr. Kofi Annan. When we went to Parliament as a government with a bill to amend the Constitution to create an independent tribunal to try the post-election violence suspects, we were not able to get the requisite 2/3 majority in Parliament. There was a campaign that against a local tribunal, that a local tribunal will be manipulated by the powers that be, that the small fish are the only ones who will be fried, that the big fish will not be tried, cannot be tried locally. So they all said that let's take this thing to The Hague. They said, don't be vague, say Hague. So we said, fine, let's just go to The Hague. That's how the matter ended up in The Hague. And then Mr. Ocampo first gave us another 4 months, which he said he did not want to come to Kenya unless, if Kenya was able to set up a tribunal. Again, we were unable to make use of that offer. So ICC then started its own investigations and then came up eventually with the six suspects who appeared before the tribunal, the ICC last week. But when Ocampo now mentioned the names, then the story changed. Then ICC became a political court. It's politics that is being played, that it is some of the presidential candidates who want to remove their challengers from the field. I am one of those who now stand accused as having influenced the ICC to take some of my opponents out of the way. But nothing, of course, could be further from the truth. The fact is that the list was prepared by the commission that carried out investigations and handed over to the ICC. Of course, the law basically says that you are innocent until you are proved guilty through the due process. And these people have not yet been tried, and therefore they are innocent. And all we say is that we wish them well in their trials. But all at the same time, what we don't want to see is the ethnicization of politics, which will polarize politics in the country and increase political temperatures at the time when a lot of reforms still need to be carried out before we go to the next general elections. I have said that regarding the support for dictators, all I'm trying to say is to draw attention to a trend that is now fairly apparent, that when we are friends, you sometimes want to look the other way when I commit mistakes. I've been saying that let us be consistent and convey the same message to everyone and all the times. We have seen some of the trends that are now taking place, particularly in Northern Africa. My view is that the wind of change that blew in Eastern Europe then came mainly to sub-Saharan Africa, left some part of the continent. And that this is more or less akin to what happened in Europe, particularly in the 19th century. It's more like it than the Eastern European phenomena, which is happening. And really it is a wake-up call, because in the Middle East, the US has been an ally of regimes who have no regard for human rights completely. Saudi Arabia, you talk about elections, they tell you, go and tell that to your grandfather. Some of the best allies of the Middle East, of the US, in those areas. But my view is that change will come. Change will come. And that's why it is important for us to be consistent. Let us not be talking two languages that contradict each other. If it is about human rights, it is about democracy, transparency, and accountability, let it apply across board. This really is what is now happening. It started in Northern Africa, and we've seen where it has spread to. In my view, even if they use the gun to try to muzzle the people, it is just a temporary arrangement. Ultimately, the will of the people shall prevail. The AU, that is Rosemary, AU, yes, has some problems because it consists of membership which are fairly disparate and are at different levels of development. And that's why sometimes reaching a consensus becomes difficult. It becomes, I remember when we had a problem in Kenya, then the AU was going to meet, the General Assembly was going to meet in Addis Ababa, and some of my friends were encouraging me to go to the AU and insist that I was the elected president. Then a friend of mine, I will not mention his name, was then a minister in the UK government, told me that, Raila, I would advise you, he was himself on the way to the AU meeting, that he should not go to Addis Ababa. Because there in that audience, many people with similar problems like the one you're having here. So you will not get a sympathetic hearing there. This is a case where you'll be better off in at the European Union meeting than an AU meeting. So sometimes I've taken contradictory stands, like in the case of AU. At first they resolved that the Bagbo should go, that they will exercise economic sanctions, yet some members violated those sanctions and went on to supply Bagbo with arms and funds. Then he said that in the event that that did not work, they would use legitimate force in order to ensure that Vitara's government was sworn in. Then eventually, when another meeting took place, then it was all again changed. They now say we are sending another mission to go and try to talk to Mr. Bagbo. And thereafter, very little was actually happening. But this because of the heterogeneity of the composure of the mix that you call the AU. But my view is that as democratization is taking place among the member states of AU, the AU will become much more and more coherent in the future. So AU actually represents the future of the continent.
Thanks very much for those clear answers. Let's take another round of questions. Let's have a gentleman up the front.
Connie Freeman, Syracuse University. Mr. Prime Minister, thank you so much for your very informative remarks. It's delightful to see you here in Washington. The last time I saw you was in Kenya. Many of your remarks related to the progress or lack thereof of democracy on the continent. And systemically, a number of people are beginning to discuss whether there's a problem with implementing, particularly first past the post type elections in African countries. And I would be interested in your thoughts on tweaking the system, as it were, to make it more participatory, more Ubuntu, etc. If there are ways that you can conceive as a politician that the system can be changed to make it more effective within the African context. Thank you.
Okay, I'm neglecting this side of the room. Let's have a question. The lady at the front there.
Hello, my name is Makeda Jiroge, and I'm a student at Howard University. And my question is just, what are some of the current developments in ethnic reconciliation that are going on in Kenya right now? And what are some of the Kenyan government's long-term plans for ethnic reconciliation?
Some of the initiatives for ethnic reconciliation in Kenya right now. And let's take a final question. The gentleman right at the end there.
Good morning, Excellence. My name is Alan Ikombo. I am with the Orange Symphony. And you said a moment ago that you sent a note or a message to President Alassane Ouattara to offer Mr. Gbagbo amnesty. Given the violence and the bloodshed that occurred as a result of his clinging to power, don't you think that giving him amnesty would have the similar effect of emboldening others to hold on to power, just like coalition governments do? And one more, if you don't mind. What is your thought about the presence of France in the events that led up to Mr. Gbagbo's arrest that has propelled them to the top of the headlines, along with Mr. Gbagbo himself and Mr. Ouattara? Thank you.
The role of France. Any comments on the role of France in ousting Mr. Gbagbo? So we have a question on electoral systems. Do they need tweaking in the African context? Efforts for ethnic reconciliation in Kenya, and then two questions on Côte d'Ivoire.
Well, Connie, the first past the post, that I don't know whether there is a kind of an electoral system that will be uniquely African. Because look at where we're coming from. What is the genesis of this problem? At independence, for example, most countries inherited fairly democratic governance structure with multi-party systems. Then immediately thereafter, a school of thought began to develop that the system which was inherited from the colonial masters was not African. That the adversarial system of resolving disputes as exists in the West was alien. That the traditional African society provided for resolution of differences by way of consensus. And that was, for example, Senghor called it a palaver. Palaver, that people sat under the tree and discussed, and eventually a consensus was arrived at. And that the multi-party system of governance was un-African. So Nkrumah also argued very eloquently along the same lines. And then they say that multipartyism was a luxury that the young developing countries could ill afford, that the gigantic task of nation building required consolidation of efforts. And that is how multipartyism was led into extinction by way of coercion, bribery, and the use of force. The opposition was led into existence, so extinction. Then they first, some of them de facto, eventually de jure, by way of legislation. Now, after a long period of struggle and so on, multipartyism was reestablished, which basically entails competition in the political process, so that political parties become instruments for peaceful brokering of competitive ideas and ideologies. And in there's no other way. If it's a competition, then there must be some benchmarks. There must be a referee, and then there must be a winner and a loser. This idea that in Africa, I mean, political parties are ethnic and so on, in my view, does not hold water. Because people will say, if it is led by so-and-so, it is the party of those people. But we have managed to develop political parties that cut across the country. But all the time they will still try to look at, oh, this party is for this because so and so comes from this region. But if you go to the United States, even this country, the states which are purely Democrats, the other states which are purely Republicans. Generally, if you go to Britain, they will tell you that is a Labour safe seat. And they will tell you this is a Tory seat. There's a blue and red, just like here, this country. So just like, for example, in Kenya, there are areas which you say are predominantly ODM, which is my party. Other areas which are PNU. But then there are other gray areas where we compete. So what is evolving in our country is not different from what exists here in established democracies. But if now it's a stronghold and you have what you call homeboy mentality even here, that is a, in that way they will never ever, because we have 42 tribes. And a leader of a political party must come from one of those 42 tribes. So if, because he's from that tribe, then that party belongs to that tribe, then of course you'll say, we'll never have. Then we're going to have 42 different tribes, parties, in my view. So it is basically a perception by the media, which is basically used to enhance democracy rather than reconciling to society, to make the society integrate. Ethnic reconciliation, we are actually been working very hard to try to reconcile the communities which have been fighting against each other. The conflicts among communities have got different origins. For example, you have issue of land, which has been a source in some parts of the Rift Valley of our country, where you have got indigenous population versus immigrants, those people who came from an area because of land scarcity and then were settled in another particular area. And the new constitution has become a very good instrument of resolving some of these disputes and historical injustices which have existed for a long time. And that's the reason why we are pushing or fast-tracking the process of implementation of the new constitution to be able to resolve the issue of land disputes and give people security of tenure, and that people can live and work in every part of the country. That's guaranteed by the new constitution. So the new land bill is now before cabinet for approval. There are other areas where you've got pastoral communities who fight over grazing land, grazing territories, cattle rustling, and so on. And again, those are ones, again, we are trying to reconcile so that they can live peacefully and disengage from the practice of robbing, because it's nothing but robbery, taking properties of other communities, using ammunitions. So we are working with the civil society, we're working together with the administration, with the religious groups, and elders of those communities to reconcile them and to ensure that they live in peace and harmony. The issue, Mr. Bagbo's amnesty, yes, I talked about amnesty because I do not believe that retribution or recrimination will solve the problem of Cote d'Ivoire. It will, in fact, open up new wounds. If you look at the results of the last elections, by the UN records and other records of other observers, the difference was about 8%. In other words, Mr. Ouattara got about 54% of the votes, Mr. Gbagbo got 46%. In the first round, when there were more than 4 candidates, Mr. Gbagbo won by 38%, Ouattara came second with 32%, then Mr. Bédié got 25%. In the second round, Mr. Bédié put his weight behind Mr. Ouattara, and that's how he increased his percentage to 54%. But 46% is a very substantial amount of votes. That basically means that Mr. Gbagbo has got support on the ground. So if you now begin to try Mr. Gbagbo, he becomes a rallying point to his supporters, which is what he really don't want in a country that is coming from civil war. The civil war will not end. That's why we are talking about a reconciliation. And if you want to reconcile, give Gbagbo safe exit, then get some of his people, because he represents a number of people, and also a big region of the country, get those people in the government. So you play a game of inclusivity. That is how to heal the wounds which are still very fresh in that country. France, of course, was a colonial master in Côte d'Ivoire, and France has had a long, extensive relationship with Côte d'Ivoire. They've got heavy investment also in that country, and there are very many French citizens who also live in Côte d'Ivoire. Of course, every country acts most of the times in its national interests, in the best national interests. But I don't think that France really should be blamed unnecessarily. We all the times try to put blame on so-called foreigners when we mess up and we're not able to solve our own problems. There's no serious evidence of French involvement in this serious one. I was there myself. The country was, of course, divided. In the north, was controlled by what you call Force Novell, who are basically the forces that are sympathetic to Mr. Ouattara. The south was controlled by Gbagbo's army, or loyal to him. In the middle was the UN, buffer zone. The UN is the one which stood in the middle. And then there was also the French. But the UN had a much bigger force, so 12,000 men strong, compared to what the French had there in the country. And then, of course, there was a stalemate. The ECOWAS had already passed a resolution that they would use legitimate force if Gbagbo refused to surrender. Unfortunately, they were not able to, because Nigeria, which should have provided the troops, are going through elections. And Jonathan told me that he will not use the army during the elections because his opponents will use that against him. But as soon as they've done elections, he will send his troops to Côte d'Ivoire. So if French troops were involved, in my view, it's positive, because this is a problem that needed to be resolved, in my view. So I do not really want to see that this is used negatively against France.
Well, we're almost out of time, unfortunately, so perhaps just time for one more question, and I guess I'll ask it myself. Lucky me, I get the microphone. You've spoken about, you mentioned the important role of the United States and the international community in promoting democracy and good governance in Africa. What are you spoke also of the need for consistency in actions and words. What's the most important thing? What's the biggest gap which the international community and the US can help fill in advancing this objective in Africa? What would you like to see the US doing more of in Africa to promote good governance?
Well, already I think let's talk about the positive side. That the US actually has been fairly proactive in trying to promote democracy in some countries of Africa. I would say, for example, in my country, they have been very much at the forefront each time, reminding us of what needs to be done, and in supporting a civil society, for example, because I believe very strongly that a strong civil society itself is a sine qua non for a thriving of democracy in a country, together with an independent, vibrant media. This, of course, has grown in Kenya. The days when they were able to come up with what we called Section 2A to make the country a single party, those days the civil society was almost non-existent in our country. Now, the U.S. has also, of course, been supporting the empowerment of women in our country, and the involvement of the women actively in political process, in my view, is a positive sign. But what I'm trying to say is that this message has not been uniform or consistent. The U.S. looks at the situation, so it's one is they deal with it on a case-by-case basis. If you look, for example, Egypt. Egypt, of course, is one of the biggest economies in Africa. Egypt is a very old country, Missouri. But Egypt has never known democracy. NASA and Co overthrew the feudal government of King Farouk in 1953. And then established the rule. In 1956, he nationalized the Suez Canal and became a hero. But then stayed on because elections were held, which were basically rituals. And in 1971, he died, and his vice president, Anwar Sadat, took over and put Mr. Mubarak as his vice president. And then went on until 1980, when he was killed, and Mubarak took over. And Mubarak then went on. Each time elections were being held, which were just rituals. There were no elections in Egypt. And nobody really said anything about what was happening in Egypt. I met with Mr. Mubarak last year. I was his guest in May last year. And he told me that this year, 2001, he was going to do an election and he was going to win. If what happened in January had not happened, of course, he would have won the September elections, and he would have been recognized. So what I'm saying is that let us go deeper beyond the surface. Let's not just be scratching the surface without looking at what is rotten, the rot that is underneath. This is really, if U.S. did this, it will really help African democratization.
Thank you very much. Well, it's been a terrific discussion. Thanks so much, Prime Minister, for being so generous with your time and answering such a broad range of questions. We wish you well on the rest of your visit and wish Kenya well on facing some of the difficult challenges in the year or so ahead. Just a note before we close. If you wouldn't mind everyone remaining in their seats just for a couple of minutes until the Prime Minister has departed. Please join me in thanking the Prime Minister for his time this morning, and hope to see you again soon.